Thanks very much. Thank you so much for inviting me today. It's been fascinating to see all this stuff all this amazing practice that's actually going on, and all of this is fantastic fodder for our work. In some ways, it makes me feel I'm somewhat here under false pretenses because I'm not doing any of this fantastic coding or mapping. The work that my COVID task force has been putting in place has been trying to affect the handling of the pandemic. But the stage that we're at the moment is trying to work out how to provide advice to the government in particular so that things get handled better in the future. And one of the things I'm most keen to get your input on today is what we should be telling them, what good bits of practice can we highlight, and how can we make sure that their policy response, which is obviously going to be informed by all sorts of politics, is also informed by the experience of people who are actually dealing with the data on a day-by-day basis. And I guess where we start from is our argument is that if you think about, well, what's gone wrong in the pandemic, data is the answer to many questions. And when we look at questions that are clinical, that are social, that are economic, very often, as you will no doubt have seen, at the root of those we find a problem of data, either a problem that we've not had access to the right data, that we didn't make investments to gather the data, or, and we'll all be too familiar with this, we had the right data and we ignored it. I'll just talk about a few of the areas that we are pushing on at the moment, but I would be really keen to hear about specific things that we would want government to be taking seriously. I think the first area where we keep coming up against problems, this is something, so our COVID-19 task force is led by Sylvia Richardson, a professor of biostatistics, and David Spiegelhalter, who is a sort of a professor and commentator on statistics who you'll be familiar with. They've been working on various of the government advisory groups, and we're trying to synthesize the things that they and the other members have been encountering. But the first problem that we really want to fix is timeliness of data. I guess really at the outset of the pandemic in the UK, we had this problem where we just weren't on the front foot with how quickly the problem was growing. I think there was a general feeling among people who were making decisions that we were maybe 4 weeks behind Italy, was the phrase you heard, when actually we were maybe 2 weeks behind. And the delay, that 2-week delay in responding, clearly, I think it's now recognised in itself, caused a really big problem, caused potentially thousands of deaths. So the question, first of all, is making sure that we've got the infrastructure in place to provide that data rapidly. The second thing, and I think I think John's example from North Yorkshire County Council really brought that home to me, the problem of underinvestment in local data. This is obviously part of a very big story, and one that ODI Leeds has told very effectively, but the fact that we've been underinvesting in the facilities of local government, of local public health to provide this information for decades, and consequently when we now need it, when we now need tools, we're reliant on heroic individuals putting things together. But how can we make the case for doubling down on that, providing more resources to people on the ground who are providing local data? Because one of the things that we know when we look at, for example, the way data has been provided in Hong Kong and Singapore, or actually even increasingly new places like New York have been good at this, data that is as localized as possible, as far as we can see, seems to affect people's behaviors more. We've spent a lot of time talking about testing as well. And I think here there is an issue of data transparency that some of you may be familiar with. It's less of a kind of open data problem, but it's a problem about openness of data, particularly before we started to get good vaccine news. But I think still, clearly there have been a lot of COVID mitigation plans that revolve around mass testing. One of the problems that we've encountered, and John Deeks on our task force from Birmingham University has been our expert on this, is that clearly if you put in place a mass testing regime, a mass rapid testing regime, you need to know quite a lot of information about the accuracy of the tests, both their specificity and their sensitivity. And one of the issues that really becomes important if you're using these tests rapidly, especially if you're having them administered by non-clinicians, is the problem of false positives. Whenever I tweet about false positives, I always get lots of people saying, aha, you're admitting that there's a case-demic, which is not what we're saying. What we're saying in particular is because rapid testings sometimes are associated with higher rates of false positive results, you need a fairly accurate idea of what those false positive rates are to design the testing regime. So you've got people like Michael Mina at Harvard University who are trying to design rapid testing regimes where you have sort of multiple rapid tests predicated on a low but not too low estimate of false positives. But what we've been encountering is the government has been spending hundreds of millions of pounds on rapid tests based on effectively, I had to choose my words carefully here, evidence provided by test manufacturers that doesn't necessarily reflect the effectiveness of these tests in the use to which they will be put. There's been a recent thing that we've been working on that came out in the BMJ about one of the rapid tests, the Innova rapid test, where this was a particular problem, and what lies at the bottom of this is if you or I want to release a pharmaceutical drug on the market, you know, you have to jump through a hell of a lot of hoops to prove that that's effective. If you want to produce a diagnostic test, the thresholds are much lower, and it's something where there's a huge need for us to be more demanding about the data that manufacturers put out there. Another thing that I think has really come out to us is just the investment in creating the data in the first place. And I think where this has really come home to roost is in coroner data, which some of you will no doubt be very closely involved with. Scotland, coroner data is pretty timely, pretty useful. And so if you want to kind of find out, earlier in the pandemic, we were very interested in the question of how quickly are COVID transmission, particularly COVID deaths, occurring among clinicians. So you're dealing with a relatively small group, so delays really matter. And it turned out that, as Professor Sheila Bird, one of our fellows, was showing, the Scottish coroner data is really good. Scottish coroners work quickly and publish their reports quite quickly. The England and Wales coroner data is relatively slow. So effectively, I think we would argue for these epidemiological purposes, it's basically useless. You're having to impute what the actual data are. And I think at one point Sheila Bird got to the point of writing to the Office of National Statistics and asking for England and Wales deaths to be taken out of the National Statistic Registrar, which is, in the world of statisticians, is kind of a declaration of war. But I think there's a real question about, well, we need to put in place the resources to make this work. And then the final thing that we're really interested in from a modelling point of view is the question of how you put together epidemiological data of the kind that we've been discussing and economic data. There is kind of one COVID skeptic argument, which we hear a lot, which says, well, if only you model the economic impact, you would not do lockdowns, and, you know, we would all just relax about COVID. And I think, you know, we fairly strongly reject that view. But what is really curious, again, there's an openness issue here. When the government takes on board scientific advice about epidemiology, those models are subject to some transparency, maybe not perfect transparency, but some transparency. They're put out there. As we saw a couple of weeks ago, when they put out data that is rubbish or badly presented, they get a lot of pushback on. And I think, you know, cross fingers that actually the government are improving even some of those faults that they made a couple of weeks ago. Economic modelling is a totally different kettle of fish. That goes on in a black box. I don't even know whether there is an economic model for COVID lockdown going on within the Treasury. You'd hope there is, but we know there's an epidemiological model. We don't know whether there's an economic model. If the government wants to reject scientific advice, there is, believe it or not, online there is a document about why and how they have to reject scientific advice. And, you know, maybe they don't always do the right thing, but there are rules, there's a process, there is something that you or I can come back to if they reject that kind of advice. Economic advice doesn't work like that, and it all happens in an entirely closed way. So I think there's a kind of, for anyone building tools, there is a real demand for a tool that, even in a very crude way that people can pick apart, starts to look at lockdowns from a health point of view and from an economic point of view. And if people have those tools or know of them, please tell me, because that's just my ignorance that I've not come across the right ones yet. And but I think it's useful in its own right. But even a tool that's really rubbish and inaccurate and people pick holes in would be useful, because it would just start telling people that this is possible, and that being open about these things is something that we should think about. I think this is a great example of what Paul always tells me, which is that, you know, reports are very bad. People shouldn't publish reports, people should publish models. And I think in this particular instance, we can spend all our time telling the government, you should be open about economics, you should publish economic models, and they will ignore me and they'll ignore you if you say that. But if someone can build a model that does that, that people can play with, I think that might be the thing that shames them into doing it. I've spoken for too long, but I would love to listen, and I would love to hear about things that we should be promoting, and other angles that people think would work, so that next time this happens, and I'm sure there will be a next time, sadly, things go better.